Historians, Mr. Birch here. Today we're going to be going over the last in our series of 5 videos where we are studying our Survivor's Guide packet and going over the questions that have been on the STAAR test about these different eras. So today we're going to be talking about Civil War and the Reconstruction eras in U.S. history. Make sure you have your Survivor Guide packet. If you don't have that out in front of you, go get it. Pause and go get it, and make sure you have it with you with a pen, marker, or highlighter, something to make notes as we go. Make sure that you print that off if you have not done so already. Go to Mr. Birch's website and print that off. You'll see on the STAAR Prep page on that website, if you scroll down to the bottom, it says like 8th grade Survivor's Guide or STAAR Survivor's Guide, something like that. Print that off. You're going to want that. You're going to need to look over that thoroughly. So you've already got that. I'm assuming you're on the last video of this series. The first video is the Colonial and Revolution era. The second video is Confederation and Government. The third video is Young Republic and Age of Jackson. The fourth video, the one you just finished, is Sectionalism and Antebellum period. And now you're on the last video. It's Reconstruction or Civil War and Reconstruction. So let's get started. Okay, sectionalism. We talked about this in the last video, but I want to briefly go over it because these are the things that caused and led to the Civil War. Sectionalism is the term used to describe the ever-widening gap between lifestyles, economics, traditions, politics, and beliefs between the North and the South, right? There's starting to be a lot of differences showing forth that have really been going on since the beginning of our colonial period, but they've become more and more evident as technology has changed and the industrial age has changed and separated the differences between the North and the South. This is based greatly on the thoughts towards slavery. So after the Mexican War ended, the U.S. had a lot of new land out west, and territories were now becoming states. There was a strong split emerging between slave and free perspectives, and the new states found themselves in the middle of this fight. Okay, antebellum, by the way, is the period leading up to and immediately before the Civil War. So if you see any questions on the antebellum period, it's the same time period as sectionalism. It's right before the Civil War. So in 1820, we have the Missouri Compromise. So Missouri is a state or a territory trying to join the Union. The northern states wanted it free. The southern states wanted it slave. Well, Missouri ended up joining the Union as a slave state, and as the compromise, Maine in the Northeast joined as a free state. But then they decided pretty much this line below Missouri, the 3630 line, it's a latitude line that runs pretty much right below Missouri, all the way across the west. From there on, they said everything south of that is going to be slave, everything north of that will be free, and that just temporarily kind of eased the tensions, but just barely and just temporarily. By 1850, there was the Compromise of 1850, by the way. It occurred right after the Mexican War, and so the U.S. has really grown. Mexican Cession is when they gave us, or we bought, or kind of stole, whatever you want to call it. After the war with Mexico, we took a lot of land in the Southwest, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado. Well, getting this land, we're trying to decide, okay, all these places, we're going to make them states, so how do we do this? Well, California entered the United States as a free state. That was part of this compromise, because if you look, most of it is below the 3630 line, so we thought according to that 1820 Missouri Compromise, they should be slave. But because of this 1850 Compromise, California was a free state. Texas shrunk down to its current size and was a slave state, by the way, already. Then Washington, D.C. was allowed slaves, but no longer allowed the slave trade. Kind of some wishy-washy stuff going on in Washington, D.C. Utah and New Mexico, these new states entering in, they would be popular sovereignty states. Popular sovereignty just means that the people in the state have the right to decide and vote within their state if they're going to be free or slave. We saw this go down in Nebraska and Kansas. It has not worked very well because there's often tension and fighting because the free state people will move to that state and the slave state people will move to that state, and then they'll fight over what their votes and the outcomes of that should be. Then the fugitive slave law became stronger. So the fugitive slave law basically gave the right for slave hunters to go from the South up into the northern free states, hunt down black people, whether they were actually free or slaves, and they would capture them and bring them south, and it basically gave them the legal jurisdiction to do so. Really not a good law, not really fair, obviously. Blacks who were once escaping from slave states to free states now begin to venture even further up into Canada to avoid these slave hunters. The popular sovereignty thing, we already kind of talked about that. It was mainly Utah, New Mexico. It was also Kansas and Nebraska. Okay, let's get on. We want to talk about the Civil War, so we're getting close here. Talking about slavery, we can't talk about the Civil War without talking about slavery. We've already went over this. You've watched the other videos. You've seen this part. You've looked at your packet, but this is not going to hurt to go over it a little bit more. Today's video will be shorter than the rest, so that's a good start at least. Slavery. The South was home to slavery mostly because they were used on farms and plantations to produce cash crops, mainly cotton, right? So slavery was illegal in the North above that 3630 line of the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise. Well, that territory that was acquired by the U.S., these southern states were fighting for it to be slave states, just like the northern states were fighting for it to be free states. Cotton gin, we know, was created by Eli Whitney, and it increased the demand for slaves because they could produce more cotton. If you had more slaves, you could produce even more using the cotton gin, and so it made them more profitable. You wanted to get more slaves because they would make you more money. Slavery was the motivating factor for southern states to want to secede. Secede means to leave the country. That and their demands for more state rights, though the main state right they wanted was, well, slavery. Triangular trade was the initial purchasing of slaves from Africa. We know that. The exchange of them, goods and money between America and Europe and Africa is the triangular trade. So abolitionists, those who fought against slavery or believed that slavery should end. That was mainly the Quakers, but there was also a lot of other groups, but they were the main religious group who opposed it because their religious beliefs said that slavery was wrong. John Brown was a white man who fought and killed many people and died himself eventually over the fight to try to free slaves, but he did it in a very aggressive fighting manner because he was what you would call he was an abolitionist, but he was fighting for the cause. Frederick Douglass was a black speaker and writer, very famous and noteworthy, writing and speaking out against slavery as an abolitionist movement. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a white woman who was an author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a fictional story that was written that inspired a lot of people to become abolitionists because her story told about the truth of slavery and how terrible it was. Even though it was a fictional story, it spoke a lot of truths. And those truths inspired people who once might have turned a blind eye to slavery, now to become abolitionists and believe and fight and speak out against slavery. The Underground Railroad was not actually a railroad. We know that. It wasn't actually underground. It's a metaphor, but it really was a thing. The Underground Railroad was the passage or the act of trying to go down into slave states and sneak out and gather runaway slaves and help them escape to freedom in the North. This was led mostly by a woman named Harriet Tubman. She was a former slave. She went back into the South, I want to say it was like 11 times to save different slaves and free them, bringing them to the northern states, and a lot of them eventually up to Canada. Quakers also helped with the Underground Railroad, as did other people. All abolitionists, of course. And we know that the Fugitive Slave Act, that prevented this. It didn't keep it from happening, but it made it illegal for anyone in the North, including Quakers or someone like Harriet Beecher Stowe. Not Harriet Beecher Stowe, I'm sorry. Harriet Tubman, anyone in the North who was an abolitionist trying to help the runaway slaves in the Underground Railroad, it made it illegal for them. Many of them still did it because their heart was to save these slaves. Okay, let's talk about the Civil War. So the causes, southern states wanted more state rights and specifically wanted more, they were pro-slavery. They wanted specifically the state rights they wanted was, they wanted to be able to have slaves, and they didn't feel like they were being represented fairly in the federal government. With more and more new states being added to the Union, tensions between the North and South arose as decisions were made for those new states to be free or slave states. So they were fighting over this. When the Republican Abraham Lincoln, who was a Northerner, was elected president, the South had all it could take: secession leaving the Union, of South Carolina first, then other southern states soon thereafter split the nation. These states begin to secede, starting with South Carolina, okay? And they formed the Confederate States. All right, so let's see here. The war starts in 1861. How did it start? The war began at Fort Sumter, which was a U.S. Union fort, right? A United States fort in South Carolina. The thing is, South Carolina seceded from the Union, claiming to be part of their own country. They were no longer part of the United States. But there was a United States fort there, as there was for many, many years. Well, they finally attacked that U.S. fort and overthrew the men who were there, killing some. And we kind of called this the start of the war because that was the first military action where they fought and, well, took over part of the, they took over U.S. fort. This was April 12th, 1861. That's the beginning of the war. We don't see, by the way, we don't see a lot of battle stuff on the STAAR test about the Civil War. That's why you don't see a lot here from me. You see one page about it because there's not a lot of that on the test, surprisingly. We do need to know a couple or three here famous names that appear on the test. Ulysses S Grant. He was a Union general. I have everything about the Union in blue here. The gray is about the Confederates. So the Union were the northern anti-slave states for the most part. The gray is the Confederate, which is those who seceded from the Union. They're the southern states. Well, so I said Ulysses S. Grant is the Union general, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson. Robert E. Lee was the commander, the chief, the top general of the Confederates. And Stonewall Jackson is another famous Confederate general, very significant one, probably the most significant one. So know those two names, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, Confederate generals, Ulysses S. Grant, Union general. Okay, a couple major victories for the Unions was the Battle of Gettysburg. It was a major victory for the Unions. And the Battle of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was famous because it cut off, it's where the Unions basically took control of the Mississippi River and cut the South in two, leading them to be split in half pretty much. Gettysburg was a massive defeat, forcing the Southern Confederate troops south out of Pennsylvania and kind of put them on the run. The North was the Union, the United States, right? Well, President Abraham Lincoln was the president of the Union, and his goal was the unifying of the country. That was his first important goal. He was trying to unify the country, bring those seceded states back into the Union. And he was willing to go to war to do it. He was willing to fight to do that, as I said here. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, that was 2 years into the war. That's where he freed all the slaves in the Confederate States. Now, because those Confederate States were claiming to no longer be part of the Union and were battling the United States, they did not free their slaves. But President Lincoln said from this point on, all slaves in the Confederate States are free. All right, the North, these are some of the advantages and some of the things about the war. The North had factories. We already know that. And because of these factories, they had the ability to produce goods and products necessary to fight a war, along with great financial resources. So the North had a lot of advantages. They also had millions more people which were capable of fighting in the war. So the North had more people, the North had more money and more goods and products and factories to produce things for war. That's a lot of advantages that the North had. Not to mention they had an established government, the United States government. Early in the war, they had weaker and less experienced leaders for battle, though. Some of their early generals were not as successful as the Confederate generals. Okay, so moving on, we got that red line there. Below that, we have the South. We have the Confederate States. The president of the Confederate States was elected by the Confederate or seceded states, right? And his name was Jefferson Davis. So he was their president. They wanted states' rights and were afraid of losing their right, well, to own slaves mostly, and equally participate in U.S. government laws and policies. So that's why they seceded. Well, the South had many disadvantages in this war, most of which were they didn't have as many people to fight, so they didn't have as many people to just go to war. They haven't had almost no factories to produce wartime goods, and they were a brand new government with a new, like, all these, they were forming their own government. It was not a organized, well scripted or organized working machine, right? So some of their advantages, though, included good generals and knowledge of the landscape, because most of the war was fought in the South, so they were very familiar with the land in which the war was being fought, which is a pretty good advantage. But overall, the North's advantage far outweighed the South's advantages. Okay, the Civil War between the North Union and the South Confederate States lasted 4 years from 1861 to 1865. The Union initially had great confidence they'd be able to outman and outgun the South, but soon learned that the Southern leadership and war tactics were often superior to their own. Led by, well, General Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, and Stonewall Jackson. The war was fought almost entirely in the southern states, though it wasn't completely in the South, which caused great destruction to much of the South. In the end, the northern strength of industry to produce all sorts of necessary materials, their governmental structure, and their abundance of people allowed them to win the war. So the North won the war. General Robert E. Lee, he was the leader of the Confederate Army. He surrendered his Confederate troops to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th, 1865. That was the end of the war. I would love to go into more detail here, but just to be clear, these are the facts that help you do well on the STAAR test, okay? This is just a summary of facts, and that's really all we see of the Civil War, is what everything I just gave you. So let's move on. Lincoln was reelected in 1864, right before the end of the war, with a more peaceful and lenient plan for Reconstruction of the South. So Reconstruction of the South, his idea was, well, after we win this war, we want to peacefully admit these seceded states back into the Union, make sure they adhere to United States law, and that they are prepared to be good members of the Union again. And we don't want to punish them for it. Well, Congress disagreed and wanted harsher punishment type plan for Reconstruction. Again, Reconstruction, reconstructing the nation, eventually allowing the southern states back in, right? After the war ends. One thing I want you to do is write on the side of your paper there, for the Congress that disagreed and wanted harsher punishment, put a little arrow out to the side in your margin and write radical Republicans. You're going to see that on the test. We'll see that here in our test questions. But the radical Republicans, they're the ones who radically wanted to punish the South for the war. Understandably so, but that's what they wanted. Okay, April 14th, 1865, right at the end of the war, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He was killed by John Wilkes Booth, who felt like that was the only solution to the problem some of the South faced. Okay, Freedmen's Bureau. What's the Freedmen's Bureau? Well, that's a federal government group set up to help newly freed slaves with things like education, voting, and some of their rights and abilities, and finding jobs and participating in life as a free person. The Freedmen's Bureau, that's what their job was. Okay, I have this little note here, says memorize these. I want you to memorize this whole packet, okay? First of all, you already know that. But the 13th Amendment, these I'm telling you to memorize because this is not like linear story. The amendments, you kind of have to just memorize them, which is which. Well, 13th, 14th, and 15th, if it ends with the 10th that you're going to see on the test anyway, then it's usually something involving good changes for slaves. So the 13th Amendment ended all forms of slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment said no state can make a law that removes or limits the rights that all American citizens naturally have. And again, this is a bullet point because there's a lot more to it, but basically it's saying that the states can't overrule the federal government's ability to have these people be free. Talking about due process and a few other things here in the 14th Amendment. But I want to say that's the only thing you're going to see on the test or that we've seen so far. 15th Amendment, that one's significant too because blacks are now given the right to vote, men only. Okay, Compromise of 1877. Southerners allowed Hayes to become president as long as the Northerners agreed to remove any of the remaining troops stationed in the South for Reconstruction purposes, essentially ending the Reconstruction era in 1877. Black codes were racist laws implemented in the South by Southern states to oppose Reconstruction and restrict blacks' rights, including poll taxes, literacy laws, sharecropping. They did everything they could to essentially make blacks kind of like slaves again without technically being slaves. Black codes were very racist laws against men and women in the South. Okay, so let's go over the timeline here for the era. We have Texas annexed in 1845, the Mexican War, 1846 to 1848. The 49ers, you got the gold rush in California in 1849. Then you have the telegraph is booming by 1850s. Manifest Destiny, we're trying to move out west. Kansas and Nebraska Act was a law allowing these new states to decide to be a slave or free state based on popular sovereignty. Remember, you're voting within your state to decide if your state should be free or slave. This didn't go well in Kansas and Nebraska. There was a lot of fighting and tension because of it. Dred Scott v. Sanford, that's the Supreme Court ruling against slavery. Remember, we said it's dreadful to be Dred Scott. He's a slave, and they decide he's not even a citizen or really even a person to be able to fight against the federal government. Railroads, there's 31,000 miles of railroads by 1860. Okay, so there's a lot of railroads, but look where most of them are, in the north and the northeast. So that means the North, the Union, has a lot of railroads, ability to ship men, soldiers, goods, and products and military equipment back and forth. The South didn't have much of that. All right, after Northern Republican Abraham Lincoln is elected president, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede. Others soon followed and formed the Confederate States. 1861, Union Fort Sumter in South Carolina is attacked by the Confederates, starting the Civil War. Also in 1861, later on, Confederate General Stonewall Jackson is victorious at the First Battle of Bull Run. 1862, we have Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson Confederate troops are victorious at the Second Battle of Bull Run. And you have Battle of Antietam. It's the single bloodiest day in the Civil War. It's not what we call the bloodiest one battle, but it's the one single bloodiest day. The Confederate troops were forced to flee southward, and Lincoln, at this point, began to shift the war towards freedom of slaves, okay? After the Battle of Antietam, he did. He was trying to free the slaves. And just you see that just days after Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He proclaimed that I'm going to emancipate, which means free all the slaves in Confederate states. Though Lincoln's main goal throughout this whole time was not necessarily freeing the slaves, it was to reunite the United States. He wanted to free slaves, but his main goal was to unite the United States. Once again, Battle of Gettysburg, it lasted 3 days, and it was the bloodiest battle. It resulted in a Union victory, though it was a messy one, a Union victory, and it forced General Lee's troops to retreat south. Then you have the Union victory right along at the same time at Mississippi. This breaks the back of the Confederates, cutting them in two from east to west. This was a real turning point where the Union began to take control of the war in 1863. Battle of Gettysburg and Battle of Vicksburg. The Union won both those. So in 1865, not long afterwards, General Lee and the Confederates surrender the war at Appomattox Courthouse. Lincoln's goal now is to quickly reunite the United States, not to punish the Confederates. Well, before Lincoln can implement his Reconstruction plan, he is killed. Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in 1865. And then shortly around this, or right around the same time, the Freedmen's Bureau is formed by the federal government to help blacks transition out of slavery and give them food, clothing, education, help them be able to vote, things like this. By the end of the year, all southern states, by the end of 1865, all southern states except Texas, well, you know Texas, had ratified the 13th Amendment, meaning that they had signed on and agreed to adhere to the 13th Amendment, which we remember is the fact that all slaves are free. And then in doing that, they were willing to rejoin the Union according to these restrictions of Reconstruction. Well, 1866, black codes, Southern laws hurting black freedoms and limiting rights. So these Southern states said, yeah, we'll come back into the Union. Yeah, we'll free the slaves, but we're going to do all these black codes that kind of take away all those rights. So that it caused a few more amendments to happen because of that. 1866 also, federal government passes Civil Rights Act of 1866, granting full citizenship to blacks, overturning the Dred Scott case. 1869, the 15th Amendment, black voting rights. And then the Compromise of 1877 ends the Reconstruction. All right. Let's get to some questions. We don't have that many questions today for this one, at least compared to the rest. And that's partly because there's just not as many questions on the tests, on the STAAR tests over the Civil War and Reconstruction, surprisingly. All right, as always, we're going to move fast through these, probably faster than you will be able to read through the possible answers. So press pause after I ask the question if you want a little bit of time here to look at the possible answers and choose on your own, because I always tell you, make sure that you're looking at these and actually engaging, trying to answer them yourself and figure out how you would answer this and why. And then when you stumble on one, you might want to make a note in your study guide, okay? Let's do it. Which of these describes a result of the 13th Amendment? I don't like this question because it's kind of tricky. Because the 13th Amendment didn't say African Americans in the South are allowed to move wherever they want. The 13th Amendment basically says that African Americans in the South are now free. They freed the slaves, right? So this is a result of this. Because you're free, now you can move wherever you want. But this question is a little tricky. So you have to remember the 13th Amendment is the freedom for slaves. So this is the only one that kind of lines up with that. Which of the following reversed the Supreme Court ruling in Dred Scott v. Sanford? That's the 14th Amendment. Remember I said that there on the timeline. The 14th Amendment, part of what it did is kind of reverse the court ruling on the Dred Scott v. Sanford case. Remember, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are all good things for African Americans. After General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, the main priority of the United States was to implement a plan to bring Confederate states back into the Union. Remember, that was Lincoln's main plan all along, was to try to reunite the United States. So right after General Lee and the Confederates surrendered at Appomattox, that was now their goal. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union. When again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Abraham Lincoln, First Inaugural Address, 1861. Which idea does President Lincoln express in this excerpt? The Union matters more than current disagreements between the state. He's saying he wants the country to unite. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution affects the lives of millions of African Americans by guaranteeing their permanent freedom from slavery. So again, I told you the teens, think of the teens, are good things for African Americans, for the slaves, or former slaves. So the 13th Amendment, well, the first one has to be freeing the slaves, right? And then the 15th one is allowing them to vote. So you have the 13th all the way 14th and 15th. So you're not going to vote if you're still a slave. So the very first of those teens is freedom. The county election, the painting of a Missouri scene, was completed in 1852. Such scenes would look dramatically different after the ratification of the 15th Amendment. If you look here and you see there's all white people in here and they're all at an election in 1852. Well, the 15th Amendment allowed blacks to vote. So after the 15th Amendment, many years after this, there would be black people there voting, hopefully. The election of Hiram Revels in 1870 was significant because he was the first African American to serve as a member of the U.S. Senate. So think just 5 short years earlier, many African Americans were slaves in about almost half the states in our country. And already by 1870, we have a first African American serving as a U.S. Senator. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. President Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, 1865. In the excerpt above, what does the interest refer to? Yeah, slavery. He's saying that all knew this interest, all knew that slavery was somehow the cause of the war. One advantage of the Confederacy had over the Union during the Civil War was that Confederate forces had knowledge of the terrain where most battles were fought. Remember, the North had more factories and more weapons and ammunition. The North had more people, so they had more military troops. The North had an extensive railroad system for moving troops and supplies. The South had none of that. The South only real advantage they had was they had good knowledge of the terrain. Provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 designated all people born in the United States, except American Indians, as citizens. Granted all citizens certain rights under the law. What is the historic significance of this act? It was the first time Congress passed a law that protected racial minorities. You may not have known that for sure, but what you can know is know the context clues in order to make this make sense here. Civil rights is usually talking about the rights of people of our country and citizens, specifically minorities, even to this day. And yeah, this one just makes the most sense of all the possible options. Bombardment of Fort Sumter. How is the event depicted in this image significant to the Civil War? The Confederate attack upon the Union fort initiated, which just means started, initiated the war. The bombardment of Fort Sumter, again, that was the first battle of the war, really. It started the Civil War. The slaves have their status in the Union, and they have no other legal status. The Union, and not themselves separately, procured their independence and their liberty. President Abraham Lincoln message to Congress, July 4th, 1861. Which constitutional issue was President Lincoln addressing in this excerpt? The legal ability of states to secede, because he's saying the states have their status in the Union and they have no other legal status. The Union, and not themselves separately, so not the states separately, procured or claimed their independence and their liberty. So these states alone don't have this ability to secede, is what Lincoln's saying. A biography on the military career of General Thomas Stonewall Jackson would include his involvement in which Civil War events? That's the first Battle of Bull Run and the Confederate victory at Fredericksburg. He participated in those. He did not participate in both of any of the rest of these here. So you may want to make a note there next to his name on your packet if these aren't already there. Pause if you need to. Ulysses S Grant graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, served in the Army during the U.S.-Mexican War, question mark, served as the 18th President of the United States. Which accomplishment could be added to this diagram? was appointed general-in-chief of the Union Army during the Civil War. Remember I told y'all that he was the leader of the Union Army during the Civil War. Question mark, leading the three topics. Encouraged African Americans to fight for the Union. Strengthened the Union militarily and politically. Shifted the focus of the war to freedom for all. Which of the following completes this diagram? The Emancipation Proclamation. That freed the slaves, which encouraged African Americans to fight for the Union, because if you're fighting for the Union, you're fighting for your own freedom. The 15th Amendment was ratified in order to protect the voting rights of African American men. Again, you just need to memorize those three amendments there, 13th, 14th, 15th. Which of these prompted Congress to propose the 14th Amendment? The black codes enacted by Southern states after Civil War. So the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment limited the rights of these states to be able to overrule the government and make laws basically that inhibited the civil rights of the black Americans. So that was what the 14th Amendment did. And then the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. What was one long-term consequence of the sharecropping system? Many former slaves became trapped in a cycle of debt. So brief overview here. Part of the black codes after the Civil War, many of these slaves did not have a lot of skills or ability to read because they were slaves. They were forced to do one task all their life. And so a lot of these former slave owners in the South, they began to force the slaves to work their land, but they said, you're technically free, so I can't force you, except that if you want to live on my land and have food to eat and have a way to support your family and live, you have to stay here and work, and I'm going to charge you rent. And that rent will actually exceed how much you make, so each year you go further and further in debt. And you can't leave my land until you pay off your debt. And so this was an endless cycle of debt that they began trapped in. It was called the sharecropping system. Because in theory, they would share crops. They would work the owner's land, and they could get a small portion of the crops to eat for their family, and the rest of the crops they would harvest for the owner of the land. Sharecropping. The abolitionist movement achieved its goal with the passage of which amendment? That's the 13th. Remember, the 13th freed the slaves. The 14th gave some rights to the slaves or former slaves. And the 15th gave them the right to vote. Which of these occurred as a result of the 15th Amendment? Well, I just gave you this one. African American men voted in the 1872 presidential election for the first time. After the Civil War, Southern states adopted black codes. 2. Limit the impact of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves, and after the war, some of the southern states, or all the southern states really, began to have these black codes to limit the freedom of these people. How did the loss of its control of the Mississippi River contribute to the defeat of the Confederacy? Losing control of the river divided the Confederacy in two and cut off its supplies. The Mississippi River runs north and south. So everything west of the Mississippi and everything east of the Mississippi, once the Mississippi was gained by the Union, was separated. They couldn't get across. They couldn't share supplies. They couldn't move things up and down the river. Many historians argue that the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln changed the course of Reconstruction. Which of the following is usually cited as an aspect of that change? The radical Republicans took control of office. Remember I told you in that one slide there that Abraham Lincoln wanted to unite the country without bringing down harsh punishment against the southern states, that he wanted to just reconstruct and bring it back together. The radical Republicans wanted to impose a lot of basically punishment on these southern states. So after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, he no longer was the president, so he was no longer there to kind of stymie the actions of these radical Republicans. One effect of the Dawes Act was that it harmed the communal structure of American Indian society. This was actually after Reconstruction. The Dawes Act was something that split up and took away community structure from the Native Americans. What it did is it was an act that forced Native Americans off their lands onto individual plots of land and gave them land or incentive in order to have them become more like assimilated or become more part of white society. That was the Dawes Act. Really doing a lot of damage to Indian culture. It was well after the Civil War, well after Reconstruction. A historian is writing an article for a history website. The article is divided into the following topics: the division of the South into military districts, the impeachment of the president, the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Which era in U.S. history is the focus of this article? This is the Reconstruction era. This is after the Civil War. If we don't know anything else, we know that the 14th and 15th Amendments are during the Reconstruction era. They're giving more liberties and freedoms and rights to the black people after the Civil War. We're reconstructing the country. All right, guys, that's everything. You have watched all 5 videos. If you've watched this one, I'm hoping you watched the 4 before it. If you have not, then go back and watch the very first one. Colonial era, and the Revolution era, then Confederation and governments, then Young Republic and Age of Jackson, then Sectionalism, then this one. All right, guys, so use this packet, use these videos, use the resources you have. Study this packet. Don't have a thing on this packet that you're not familiar with, okay? Make sure you're doing that. And then in the end, when you get to the test and you're taking the questions, process of elimination. Know what the question's asking, know what it means, read it carefully, take your time on this test. You have plenty of time. And then eliminate the options that you know are wrong. If you come to a question that completely stumps you, then put a little note by it, put a star by it, and move on. Come back to it later. Maybe something else, a future question, will help trigger your memory. Okay? If you have any questions, need any help, contact me, and I'm more than willing to do a tutorial with you. Thank you.